Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ernestine Lahey, Associate Professor of Linguistics and Rhetoric at University College Roosevelt, Netherlands. Dr. Lahey research interests include stylistics, text world theory, literary landscape representation, and Canadian literature and culture. Dr. Lahey has major contributions to text world theory, which include co-editing a book in 2016 entitled World Building Discourse in the Mind. She has also published a number of articles in many areas. Dr. Lahey is also a creative writer of short stories and poetry. And in 2012, she was longlisted for the CBC Short Story Prize. She has kindly agreed to speak to us today on the subject of landscape in literature. The session is about her most recent publication titled Death by Nature. Today, the Linguist Lounge, which is the name of the forum that hosts Dr. Lahey today, aims to be interdisciplinary, multicultural, and international, with a special focus on women empowerment. Dr. Ernestine Lahey perfectly captures the essence and the objective of the forum. In fact, she's a Canadian woman who teaches in the Netherlands and is an authority on text world theory, a cognitive model of human discourse processing. Thank you very much. We really appreciated Dr. Lahey for accepting our invitation and coming to us at MSA University virtually to grace us with a much anticipated lecture. Please join me, everyone, to welcome Dr. Ernestine Lahey.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor. I'm flattered and I'm honored to be part of the launch of the Linguist Lounge, which looks like a wonderful initiative. You should be very proud of such an initiative, I think. I want to thank Manar as well, Dr. Elvash, for all of her very careful organization in getting this talk organized. Thanks so much. So what I'm going to talk about today, as you just heard, is some work that I have been doing recently on landscape in literature. And I didn't include this information on the slide, but this is research that was recently published as a chapter in a book that I edited with some colleagues. I'll just sort of show you the book here. It's called Language in Place, Stylistic Perspectives on Landscape, Place, and Environment. And this I edited with my colleagues, Daniela Francesca Verdes and Elisabetta Zuru. So the paper itself is called Death by Nature in Two Poems by Alden Nolan. And what I'll do is just start by telling you a bit about who Alden Nolan is. Alden Nolan is a Canadian poet, English Canadian poet. He is a fairly important 20th century Canadian poet, included in most of the overviews and anthologies of the period. He was born in the eastern province of Nova Scotia, but lived most of his adult life in the neighboring province of New Brunswick. And a couple of things about him that are relevant for what I will say later are that he was, quote, born in poverty and raised in poetry, says Fulford in 2017. I'll come back to this point a little bit later. And that he employs in his poetry a strong sense of locality. And indeed, related to this is the point that critics in Canada have also often described or depending on your perspective, dismissed Nolan as a quote unquote regionalist poet. So as a poet whose work is mainly important at the provincial or regionalist level, although, as I said, he is included in most of the major anthologies or summaries or surveys of the period. So I'll come back to these points later. What I want to do in this talk is to show you how Nolan's work engages, or at least two poems from his oeuvre engage with a very prominent theme in 20th century Canadian literature, and that is the theme of death by nature. And I borrowed this phrase from Margaret Atwood, who says in 1972 in her very prominent Within Canada thematic guide to Canadian literature that death by nature, not to be confused with natural deaths such as heart attacks, is an event of startling frequency in Canadian literature. The Canadian author's two favored natural methods for dispatching his victims are drowning and freezing. And as you can see, Atwood calls the book survival. So here very clearly this idea that Canadian literature is busy with the landscape as a wild, savage, and dangerous place. And so what I want to do is look at how this is reflected in Nolan's work. That's my main aim. I have some secondary aims. One of these is to further elaborate and consider, excuse me, text world theory's approach to world building. I'll say more about text world theory in a moment. I also want to reconsider this idea of Nolan as a regionalist writer, to examine in how far this can actually be upheld. And although it wasn't actually an aim for me starting out, one of the byproducts of this research is that I've had to think about and grapple with current ideas about conceptual metaphor theory, and specifically how directionality works in conceptual metaphor theory. So I'll come to that a little bit later too. I want to start with text world theory, and I'm aware from the communication that I've had with Dr. Alvash that I'm speaking to a mixed audience, I think. So I think, if I'm right, some of you are perhaps more advanced in your careers in linguistics, and some others of you are students. And so it may be that some of you are less familiar with cognitive stylistics, or cognitive poetics, as some call it, and perhaps less familiar with text world theory. But for this talk, I think really all you need to know is a few basic things. Text world theory is very simply just a theory of how meaning is made in discourse. How do we negotiate meaning in discourse? And discourse, in this sense, in text world theory, is seen as comprising a series of interconnected worlds or mental representations that we as participants in discourse build up in our minds in order to make sense of the unfolding discourse. The theory owes its origins to the work of Paul Worth, and specifically a monograph published in 1999 posthumously. But it's been developed quite a bit since then, especially through the work of my colleague Joe Gavins, who has made considerable contributions to the development of text world theory. So what is a world in text world theory? A world is simply a situation, really. It consists minimally of a time, a location, some characters, and some objects. That's all a world is. And obviously for someone interested in landscape in literature, as I am, the most relevant of these variables is location. So when looking at landscape in literature from a text world theory perspective, my question, I guess, for text world theory is, what does text world theory say about how location is established? And here I turn to Worth's monograph, where he says, okay, the world builders for location are primarily locative adverbs, noun phrases with locative meaning, and locative adverbial clauses. And he gives some examples of these, and I've reproduced these on the slide here in blue. Now, it's important to say that Worth does say elsewhere in his monograph that other cues can sometimes signal location, and he includes general knowledge cues, he says, and he provides one or two examples, but he doesn't really emphasize this particularly strongly. And for me, I think what the reader is left with after reading the work of Worth is indeed this idea that there's a kind of checklist of linguistic features or linguistic elements, which if you can just find them, they will tell you about the location of your text world. And I think that this is short-sighted. There's much more going on in a text that contributes to the reader's understanding of the landscape of the text world than simply a checklist of linguistic units, syntactical units, as we see on the slide here. So let's investigate this a little bit further. I'm going to show you the first poem that I am interested in talking about today. It's called Hens. And hopefully you can see that well enough. I think I'm not going to read it out, but I will just be quiet for a moment and I'll let you have a look at this poem yourself. Okay, I hope that's been enough time. I know it's often difficult with poetry. You want to read it a few times and really get a sense of it, but hopefully that was enough for you to have a quick scan. So how is landscape built in this poem? That's the question that I'm interested in. And the first thing that I notice when I look at a poem like this one, or when I look at this poem actually, is that there are actually no place names mentioned in the poem. And there are no other locative noun phrases in this poem. There are some locative adverbials, which do provide some sense of deictic positioning. So for example, we see beside the horse troughs, but these really don't establish location on a macro level. They don't give us a sense of landscape, I would argue. Indeed, the text world landscape for this poem is mostly construed through an assembly of non-locative noun phrases, beginning with the title itself, Hens, which already gives us a sense, okay, hens, this is probably related to a rural landscape, perhaps a farm. There's nothing like a locative noun in the sense implied by Worth. However, what we do get is these, as I said, an assembly of these non-locative noun phrases. So first hens, but also horse troughs. We get manure, we get feathers, etc. And what this does is that these noun phrases work as metonymies to signal a farm schema. So a schema for a farm is activated through our processing of these noun phrases. What this means then, what I'm saying is, when I say a schema, a knowledge schema, is that actually the reader's construction of landscape in this poem depends very heavily on the knowledge that the reader brings to the text about how farms work, what they look like, etc. There's actually a second schema that is activated in this text, which I'm not really going to talk about because of reasons of time. I do talk about it in the chapter on which this talk is based, and that is a military schema. But I'm just going to leave that to one side for today. I hope that's okay. So we have this farm schema, which is activated through these nouns. Note that the word farm doesn't actually appear anywhere in the poem itself. The process through which the schema is activated is a process of metonymic chaining. And here I'm referring to the work of Barcelona in 2005. And metonymic chaining involves repeated related metonyms that are chained, as the term suggests, so that are linked to one another and that together provide access to an existing knowledge frame for the participant in discourse. What's interesting about this, how this works, is that once you have this farm schema activated, the landscape can be further populated with more elements, because we can make inferences about other aspects of the landscape based on this farm schema. So for instance, if there are hens, then we know there's probably a coop, a chicken coop. There are probably fences around this area. There's probably a barn. There are other animals. There's somewhere to store feed, maybe there's a tractor, there's surely there's a house nearby, et cetera, et cetera. We're probably in a rural center, we're not in an urban place. So all of these inferences can now be drawn, and a picture of the landscape, which is very rich, can now be built up, even though we are not told any of these things explicitly in the text. And this is the process that I find so fascinating. Also, if you look at the reference to winter in the third line, this will further contribute to the elaboration of the landscape. So now we know it's winter, it's cold, perhaps the trees are bare, perhaps there's smoke, issuing from a chimney, etc. And the reference to freezing in the second stanza, we see until his comb and spurs were frozen and bled, reinforces for the Canadian reader, the expectation that this is a Canadian winter and a Canadian location. Now, this is, obviously you could argue, well, there are other places in the world where winters are very cold and things freeze, and that's absolutely true. But what we have to bear in mind is that Nolan is writing primarily for a Canadian audience. His poems are circulating within Canada mostly. It's primarily Canadians who are reading Nolan. I'm willing to bet that most of my audience today, if not all of my audience today, hasn't maybe heard of Nolan and probably hasn't read his work. And that's because he mainly circulated within a Canadian context. So the reference to winter and freezing will, for most readers, be very specifically a Canadian reference, or a reference to a Canadian landscape. So that's I think how landscape is constructed in the text. But there's something else going on in this text that I also want to talk about, and that is how metaphor seems to work here. And as I said at the beginning, an examination of metaphor was not a primary aim for me, but it kind of is a byproduct that I had to contend with when I was doing this research. Because what you'll notice, I think, if you look at the text, is that there certainly is a sort of metaphorical undercurrent in the text in which animals and humans are being compared in some way. So I'm just going to actually go back for a sec. We see beside the horse troughs, General Grant. This is a name that we would associate with a person. So perhaps when we're first reading it, we think that this is a person, swaggered and foraged, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually, it becomes clear that General Grant is probably a rooster. That's what it seems to be suggesting. But all of the hens as well have the names of heroes. So they're also named after apparently military individuals. So there's this relationship between animals and humans here in this text that's being made. Now, there are two things you have to understand, I guess, in order to understand the point I want to make here. The first is that conceptual metaphor theory, which is the theory that was proposed in 1980 by Lakoff and Johnson in Metaphors We Live By, and has since been developed by a number of other scholars in cognitive linguistics, suggests that the way conceptual metaphor works is that you have a source domain from which you want to take the characteristics that you will apply to some target domain, and that mapping from source to target domain is unidirectional. So we apply elements from the source domain to the target domain, and we do not have any leakage or any feedback from the other direction. It's a unidirectional relationship. That's point one. The second point is that this term mega metaphor that you see on the slide is one I'm taking from Paul Worth, so from text world theory. And Worth says that a mega metaphor is an extended metaphor that reveals something about the meaning of the text. It actually reveals the gist of the text, what the text is centrally about, and then it's often connected to culturally relevant concerns. So that's where that term comes from that you see on the slide here, the mega metaphor. Now in hens, there is an important mega metaphor, which is triggered by this anthropomorphization of the animals on the farm. You have the General Grant and the hens with the names of heroes, etc. However, is it fair to say that the underlying mapping here is that animals are humans, that the animals are simply being anthropomorphized? Because General Grant is described in terms which certainly have currency in everyday use in describing people and men in particular. So for example, stud and spurs, and with spurs, I'm thinking of the spurs on the, the cowboy boots of days gone by. However, I think can't simply say that General Grant is personified, because the terms that are used to describe him can also apply equally simply to animals. So a stud is a horse, and some birds also have spurs on their feet or legs. So Nolan seems to be frustrating our attempts to decide whether we should be mapping human characteristics onto animals or not. Or perhaps what he's saying is we need to think about humans in animal terms. Yeah, he frustrates our attempt to see which direction the mapping should be in. Because the reader is also invited to consider, I would argue, the opposite mapping, that humans actually are like animals. And I would say that this frustration is deliberate. Nolan deliberately applies terminology or lexis, which is clearly polysemous and has polysemous extensions, providing access to two different schemas that are competing here. Now, the point then that I want to make here is that this, indeed, because this seems to be a deliberate frustration of our attempt to figure out which direction the metaphorical mapping should go in, that we need to rethink maybe whether we have to make this choice. If we go back to very early work by Black in 1954, Black says, if to call a man a wolf is to put him in a special light, we must not forget that the metaphor makes the wolf seem more human than he otherwise would. So already in 1954, Black, and there were a few others as well, was saying, wait a minute, metaphor doesn't have to be unidirectional. It can be bidirectional. There's a leakage, there's a feedback from the target domain back to the source domain. And recently, a number of other scholars have also started to think about metaphor differently and to consider this bidirectionality. And I think that that's what's happening here. So I think we need to explore this idea a little bit further. The other point here is related to this, that there's a tension then between these two contradictory readings, which is really central to the poem. And I think that what Nolan is doing here is also reflecting on some other binaries, some other tensions in the poem. So for example, there's a tension between literal and figurative. There's a tension, I think, between male and female, between weak and powerful, between civilized and wild. And the meaning of hens is it turns on these binary oppositional relationships. Yeah, the opposition, the tension, the clash is the point. And I would refer you here also to work by Leslie Jeffries on opposition in her 2010 book, Opposition in Meaning, which is a wonderful exploration of how opposition works in discourse. Now let's think about this in terms of Canadian literature. What jumped out to me is that this focus on the clash, the binary, really relates to some work in Canadian literature in the late 20th century, especially by Bentley, who reflects on the distinction between the baseland and the hinterland. He says that, all of Canadian literature is concerned with this distinction between baseland and hinterland. And what we see in Hens is this clash between the ordered domesticity of the farm, the baseland, and the wildness, the wilderness of the hinterland. What's my point here? My point about this poem is that this binary clashing or contradiction is actually reflecting national anxieties, national concerns about the baseland and the hinterland in this apparently very regionalist poem. Yeah, so we can say that this is a regionalist poem, but from my view, Nolan is clearly engaging with national concerns. The second poem that I want to talk about is very different. Canadian January Night, this is called. And it's very different because certainly, at least in terms of location or landscape, we immediately know where we are. Canada is signaled already in the title. And so this is quite different from Hens. And again, maybe I'll be quiet for just 1 minute and let you read through it. Okay, hopefully that was enough time. So the link to a real world location is, as I've said, explicit here, but note that it's still really mainly through noun phrases and non-locative noun phrases that the landscape is richly fleshed out. So we get a reference to an ice storm and a hill, cars, etc. So for most readers, I think this would provide a fairly rich representation of the landscape, again, augmented by knowledge of Nolan's life. That we would perhaps maybe fill in the blanks and assume that he's writing about a region where he lived or where he grew up. Now, how does death by nature work in this poem? Well, it's actually very explicit in this poem, more explicit than it is in Hen's, I would say, because you see, you know, here toward the bottom of the poem, this is a country where a man can die, so it's very explicit, simply from being caught outside. Now let's look at these lines in a bit more detail. This is a country where a man can die. Let's start there. So this is Atwood's Death by Nature, isn't it? Very clearly. This is, I would argue, this very prominent 20th century Canadian critical theme, represented in this poem as the concrete fear of an individual poetic persona. So we have this individual poetic persona identified by the pronoun I walking backwards in obedience, who is afraid of dying in the environment here. The poetic persona, I would argue, in this poem is actually a representative Canadian, because he is because he has this concern of, you know, this is a country where I can die from the elements, from being exposed to this savage landscape. So we have a metaphor that has become entrenched within the Canadian national psyche, Atwood's Death by Nature, being here metonymized as the aspect of a single fictional or poetic mind. Yeah, so the poetic persona of this poem is construed as a representative Canadian whose mindset really reflects the general outlook of an entire culture. And how this works in textual theory terms is quite interesting. Textual theory makes use of these diagrams to help us to concretize for ourselves as analysts how discourse works. These are, of course, gross oversimplifications of the actual discourse process, but they do help us to, you know, schematize and concretize what it is we're saying about a text. Oh, I spotted a typo here, where a person can die. That should be where a man can die. My apologies. But what we see here is that the persona, the poetic persona, he is possessed by a fearful knowledge. So the reference to knowledge triggers a shift away from the main text world of the poem to a modal world, which is epistemic because it deals with knowledge. So we have a world which is one level removed from the text world. He is possessed by a fearful knowledge that this is a country where a person can is a deontic modal verb. So now we have another shift to another world, a deontic modal world. And in that world, a man dies. So a man dies in a world that is 2 levels removed from the main text world. I'm sorry if this is all a bit abracadabra in terms of, you know, for those of you who maybe are not super familiar with textual theory, the only point that I'm trying to make here really is that the death happens clearly in the persona's mind. It's part of his psyche, and therefore, based on the arguments I've made in the previous slide, part of the national psyche. It's entrenched within the national psyche that a man can die because of nature in Canada. You will also have noticed, I think, that there's a double syntax going on here in these lines. So this is a country where a man can die simply from being caught outside. When we first read this, we perhaps read it as, this is a country where a man can die. And then we go to the next line and we realize, oh, the clause continues, simply from being. And then we go to the next line. Oh, it continues again, caught outside. So there are 2 moments actually where we potentially think the clause has ended. And then we have to reparse the syntax because we realize that it carries on. And what double syntax does, according to Empson 1961 and also Gibbons and Whiteley 2018, is that it triggers 2 or perhaps even 3 here competing interpretations. So this is a country where a man can die, number 1, can die simply from being, number 2, and can die simply from being caught outside, number 3. We actually have 3 interpretations here. So in the, I think in the most literal interpretation, Canada is a country where a person can die from exposure after being caught, which is to say, caught unawares or caught suddenly outside in a winter storm. Yeah, that's, I think, the most literal level that we have here. And this is supported also, I think, by the syntax, and I'll get to that in a moment. That there's another interpretation, which is this is a country where a man can die simply from being, and that's interesting to me. Yeah, so being as existing. Note as well that this simply from being is iconic because it is deviant from the rest of the text in terms of its layout. Yeah, it's deviant compared to the established or the surrounding co-text. So this second interpretation is which is reinforced by the iconicity of the text itself, the layout, is the idea that Canada is a country where a man can die, or this is a country, perhaps maybe not Canada, but this is a country where a man can die simply from existing, simply from being. Now, let's go back to something I said earlier about Nolan. Nolan was, as one critic has said, born in poverty and raised in poetry. Born in poverty, indeed, yeah. Nolan was born and raised in rural Nova Scotia in very difficult circumstances. He describes his own childhood as a pilgrimage through hell. He suffered a number of abuses. He was exposed to quite a lot of alcoholism and violence in his youth. And it was really a very tough and very hyper-masculine world in which he grew up. And as a result, we know that Nolan kept his writing secret. He developed a habit of covering up his writing when someone would walk into the room because he was bullied frequently for being too sensitive. Knowing this, I think, asks us or forces us or encourages us at least to interpret this poem in a different way. I think we get a poem then that in its layout and in the double syntax reflects Nolan's position as an outsider in this world that he was born into. Yeah, he can die simply from being himself, basically, in this context. Yeah, I think a very powerful message. It always gets me in this poem. I find it very moving. So here then, I think we get a poem that plays into national concerns in its very literal, explicit evocation of this death by nature theme, but it also has more local significance in its allusion to Nolan's childhood and the realities of life in rural Canada in the 1930s, the sort of post-Depression era. And the point that I want to make here with regard to Nolan is that his concern with the regional is not lost when he takes on national concerns more explicitly. So I hope that that's been okay in terms of time. I'm a bit afraid I've gone over. I just want to briefly conclude. What's the takeaway from what I've said here? I suppose number one, that text world landscape construction relies on a whole range of world building cues, and you really can't limit this to a checklist of syntactic units or linguistic features. You've got to look at it in a more holistic way. The second point is with regard to Nolan specifically, that careful stylistic treatment of Nolan's work reveals much more complexity than literary critics have often afforded him. Yes, perhaps he was a regionalist poet, but in my view, at least, he was certainly one who reflects on national anxieties in his work. And finally, again, as a byproduct and almost an accidental finding in doing this research, I think we've got to rethink directionality in conceptual metaphor theory and to think about the extent to which there's a washback effect from the target domain to our understanding of the source domain in these kinds of mappings. And that's what I had to say today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lahey, for such a very interesting and intriguing talk today.
Thank you.
Actually, you have a great ability in making a complex topic or theory quite understandable and so much appealing to students and scholars who are around here. Now, the whole today is full. We have full house. We have so many students and staff members around here who have heard your lecture and enjoyed it as much as I myself did, and Professor and the Dr. Al-Wahsh is as well. You easily captivate your audience, even if it's a virtual talk. So thank you very much. Quite a challenging task. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you don't mind, can we take a couple of questions from the audience around? If you have questions concerning the talk, you can prepare yourself in a minute. Until I ask mine, or Dr. Al-Wahsh, maybe she, and Dr. Manar, maybe she wants to ask a question or so. Yeah, until you have a question. Okay, yes, please go ahead.
Hello, doctor.
Hi, hello.
Hi, this is Manar. Thank you very much.
Hi, Manar.
The first time we talk.
Yes.
Thank you very much for being here and answering all of those emails. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
So I have a question. Maybe it's a bit related to unidirectionality, or maybe not understanding things on the basis of unidirectionality. And this is on your chapter, author, character, ethos, and Dan Brown's novels. So my question here is also related to trying to understand the upward influence in the construction of discourse world. And it's not really is it related to what you said about this, the bidirectionality of metaphor as well? Can we tie these phenomena together, that a source domain and a target domain can have this leakage, and also this discourse world and text world can have this leakage as well? They can influence each other. Are they related?
That's a very good question. And it makes me realize that I have been awfully concerned, I guess, in my research with questions of directionality or binaries. You know, in that article that you're talking about there, I'm talking about, you know, to what extent does the text world influence the discourse world? And in the paper that I've just presented on, it's more about the source and the target domain. I haven't really thought about your question before. Are they related? I suppose they are, insofar as, look, the source and target domains of metaphors are also mental representations. They're also conceptual constructs, as are the discourse world and the text world. So insofar as we're in both cases talking about these mental representations, these conceptual constructs, whatever terminology you want to use, I guess, I mean, although I haven't made this argument, but I guess you could start to ask, is it always the case when you have linked conceptual constructs or mental representations that there is this interaction, that it isn't just unidirectional, that there's got to always be some kind of leakage or feedback? But again, I haven't really ever thought about it in those very, very general terms before. But I suspect that could be the case. I suppose, I hope that answers your question, but I'm very grateful for the question, because now I realize this is something I need to think about. Is this a general tendency? So thank you for your question. And I hope I answered it well enough.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was great.
Dr. Ernestine, if you don't mind, I'm a literature person rather than a linguist, but I don't think that there is this gap between being a person who is more interested in literature than using the terminology used in the field of linguistics, because I do believe that they are inseparable, that both are the same for a person who really is interested in the field of humanities, or let's say the world of English language studies in general. but I'm not very much familiar with the terminology that is used in the area of linguistics in general.
Mm-hmm.
I was very much intrigued by the terminology that you have been using, like the mega metaphor, and of course, contradictory readings and the binary opposition between that is actually, it reflects the kind of tension that is available or is there, that exists in the national anxieties of a kind. Do you mean that readers in general, or readings of such poems in general, are very culturally specific? I mean, can they reach the level, if you may allow me to use this expression, that they can have this kind of global, or reflect the same ideas globally, or is it very cultural specific? Because you're talking about, I mean, do I have to be quite familiar with these national anxieties in order to get the meaning directly? Or can the meaning or the images be conveyed clearly to readers wherever they are globally, worldwide?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would say that a meaning can be conveyed globally, certainly. And I suppose I would be hesitant to talk about the meaning, because I think, that's what the best literature does. It allows for different shades of meaning. But certainly, when you're reading authors who have been as concerned with specifically national or cultural concerns as Alden Nolan has been, but there are other poets that I've worked on as well in my research who are even better examples of this. I'm thinking, for example, of Al Purdy. He's the poet who I actually mainly work on, and he's been called Canada's voice of the land, for example. He's really been held up as someone who focuses on Canada as a place, Canada as a culture, et cetera, a nation. When you're reading someone who has this commitment to writing about local concerns, then if you have that knowledge as a reader of whatever those local concerns are, that becomes activated. Of course, if you don't have that knowledge, then it works differently. Then you let's say, make do with whatever schemas you have. So no, I would never say that there's no relevance to this literature in a global context, but certainly the knowledge schemas that a reader brings to a text like the ones I've looked at today will be different. I mean, I can imagine a reader of Canadian January Night who has never been to Canada and never experienced a Canadian January will still have knowledge that is relevant. We all read other books and we watch films and television, and we have access to images and other textual representations of Canada and of winter and of cold places. So of course that is activated. But that, I think, is different from the very culturally specific knowledge that comes from having grown up in that context. So So again, to be very succinct in my answer, I definitely think these texts can be globally meaningful. I don't think there is a single meaning to be derived from them, but I do think what we bring as readers to these texts is fundamental to how we process the meaning that we make from them.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does, actually. Yeah, thank you very much. And because I do also agree about, what do we mean by schema? And when you mentioned the first poem specifically about the schema of the hands and how this would actually get into the mind of the reader or the listener of the poem, that the form and everything. again, this might differ, of course. Now we have this kind of different schema of different people. So yes, this diversity of interpretations and the diversity of getting the or the schema in general of the readers of poetry or art in general or literature in general. So again, this would mark as a part of the postmodern era where, I mean, we have this kind of diversity and interpretations open-ended without any limits.
Absolutely.
Any questions among the audience? Yes, you do have a question. Yes. Would you please come to the front and hold the mic so that Dr. Ernestine may hear the question? Yes, probably.
Hello, Doctor. I just have a question. I really enjoyed your idea and your approach.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I did understand your point here that how the landscape, how studying or approaching landscape in poetry can uncover the Canadian anxieties. Yes, this is what I got right. Okay, I just have a question here. You talked about metaphors, and this is one of the tools that can do this. And you talked about the mega metaphor. Is it, you mean by the mega metaphor, it's the unidirectional? This is equal? That's right.
Yes and no. So a mega metaphor, thank you so much for your question. I'm sorry that that wasn't clear. Mega metaphor is the term that is used by Paul Worth, who is the founder of text world theory, to basically describe an extended metaphor. So actually, mega metaphor is synonymous, more or less, with the traditional literary term, a literary critical term, extended metaphor. It simply means a metaphor that is sustained through repeated manifestations throughout the discourse. However, I say yes and no, because that's, so the meaning of the definition of mega metaphor is not, it's not about the unidirectionality. Having said that, Worth's understanding of how metaphor works is informed by this theory of conceptual metaphor by Lakoff and Johnson, in which it is a unidirectional phenomenon. So for Worth, mega metaphor would have been also a unidirectional phenomenon, yes.
Okay, and the interactional?
Yeah, so that I'm afraid, yeah, that's my term. So that is the term that I'm using now to, at least tentatively, in my thinking about this feedback or this washback effect from the target domain to the source domain, that we have to see metaphor more as an interaction and less as a transfer.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for actually the session today is not only important for the scholars whom we have around. You have another question. Okay, we have Dr. Rania Al-Wakil. She is asking another question. Can you take this?
Sure, yes, yes.
Okay, hello everyone. I have a question.
I'm sorry, I'm afraid I can't actually hear you on that microphone. I'm so sorry.
Can you if it's not working, if this one is not clear, if the sound is not, okay, can you come here, please?
Okay, my question concerns more authentic types of discourse. Being a course analyst, I'm not really interested in literature. I'm interested more in authentic instances of language use. So my question is, would all the tools and the theory of the text word, the aspects of text word theory and the extended metaphor could relate to the discourse metaphor? Can we extend this as a tool of discourse analysis, of reaching some kind of stereotyping in discourse, of schematicity in discourse? I mean, we have now different forms of discourse, social media discourse, TV discourse, classroom discourse. So can we extend these tools of conceptual metaphors to discourse analysis in this respect?
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. I think absolutely, yeah. Paul Wirth was very insistent when he developed text world theory that he was developing a theory that could be applied to all forms of human discourse. And actually, since then, one of the things that a lot of text world theorists have been busy with is testing the boundaries of text world theory, basically trying to break it. Yeah, let's take this theory and see what we can apply it to until it breaks. And I would say it hasn't broken so far. It's, you know, it's extended, it's been augmented. Certainly, it's been challenged in some ways, but we see in the scholarship applications of text world theory to all kinds of discourse, and it is also used in more sort of critical discourse analyses as well. So there are a couple of well, I suppose, you know, and this is not a blatant self-promotion, but I suppose the easiest way to see the range of examples that you can apply text world theory to is to indeed have a look at this book that I edited in 2016 with Joe Gavin's World Building Discourse in the Mind, because there are some examples in that book where text world theory is applied to non-literary text. So the first part of my answer would be to say text world theory, absolutely, yes, can be applied to different types of discourse, not just literary texts. But your question, I think, was more specifically about metaphor. Now, I haven't thought about, you know, the directionality issue in metaphors in non-literary texts. However, as a cognitive linguist or cognitive stylistician, I would say that it will work. It will work in all kinds of discourse. If it doesn't work in all kinds of discourse, then I'm wrong. And the reason that I say that is because the commitment of a cognitive linguist should be to applying what is known about the human mind to how language works. And it needs to work in all kinds of discourses, because it should be about how the mind works, not about how literature works. So how the mind works in engaging with language, and not just how one specific type of language works. So yes, if we have a theory of metaphor that breaks as soon as we apply it to another type of discourse, then I think that theory is wrong. So I would venture to say that, you know, assuming that I'm right about this interactionality or this bidirectionality, and I think I do need to test this a bit more, but assuming that this is correct, then it should certainly work in, you know, critical linguistics, critical discourse analysis.
Thank you very much. I think this answers the question.
Thank you.
I want to let you know that this lecture today was quite important and quite useful also for not only scholars, but our students who are whom we have around here. Of course, this was a little bit more advanced than their expectations, but it's very good to get exposed to lectures or talks about important and advanced theories, and probably you have another question. Maybe we take another.
Yes. Yeah.
Question,
no problem.
please. Okay.
No problem.
Would it be the final one? Yeah. You don't want to keep you. Okay. As you.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for an interesting topic. Now, I need to ask you about something. You have talked about binary clashing and contradiction as a way of understanding conceptual metaphors, right? Now, if the conceptual metaphors are understood through these binary clashes, how much of it that it serves if these metaphors are mental representations? Because at this point, the mental representation are a result of someone's experience in reading of the metaphor. So the differences in reading one metaphor doesn't deny the commonality of the same experience, right? So how would these differences and cultural binary clashes would serve if we're making a conceptual or mega metaphor read cross cultures or cross literature.
Okay, let me see if I understand your question. So are you asking how these clashes between two competing mega metaphors, how such a clash can be understood on a more global perspective, sort of outside of the specific culture to which it pertains? Is that your question?
Yes, especially when it is when a metaphor is a mental representation. This mental representation would vary even within the very same culture. So
yes, that's true.
Contain it.
Yeah. I suppose the simple answer is that it often wouldn't be evident without, outside the specific culture. And this was the point I was trying to make earlier. So if we think about, the first poem I talked about, Hens, where I made this argument that you have two competing mega metaphors and that this is the point for Nolan. I think this is the point that will be potentially picked up on by careful Canadian readers with the appropriate schemas, Canadian, relevant knowledge schemas about this binary. However, I wouldn't expect this to be noticeable for those, outside of that context. I do still think that the tension between the two alternative ways of mapping the metaphor will be evident. For me, it's still, no matter where you come from as a reader, it's still unclear whether Nolan wants us to think of these animals as humans or whether he wants us to reflect on the more animal characteristics of humans. So is it humans are animals or animals are humans? For me, that tension remains, and any reader has to resolve this. But I certainly wouldn't expect a reader who doesn't have the relevant Canadian, understanding of Canadian cultural history to then link that to Bentley's idea of the baseland and the hinterland. No, absolutely not. So I'm not, I guess, to be fair, I guess I'm not talking about any kind of quote unquote ordinary reader. I'm talking about a reader who has a very deep and very particular understanding of these debates in Canada. And so I'm being a little bit elitist, I guess, in my analysis here, and not terribly democratic. I'm not. How can we access the real reader? But we have to be aware that there are different kinds of real readers. I am no less a real reader than someone who doesn't study Canadian literature, and my more advanced knowledge of the debates in Canadian literature feed into my readings. So and I'm sorry, I'm digressing maybe a little bit, but the point is that we can't just say that we have a reader who does X. There are different readers and they will bring different things to the text, and we need to acknowledge that. And I hope that answers your question, I hope.
Thank you very much indeed for a very interesting session. As I was just saying a little bit earlier, this is very important also for our students who are around here. Mm-hmm. Very good. It's very important for you to get exposed to scholars and theories and analysis, ideas that are currently in vogue, that are currently the trend in the field of linguistics and literature and stylistics. And actually, this was of interest to everyone around. Thank you very much. We can't thank you enough for the
thank you.
Class. I would like to give you a hand, everyone. We hope we can meet again, even, I mean, in reality, if you.
That would be wonderful. That would be. Yeah. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person today. That's a shame. But thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. And again, I'm really honored and flattered to be part of the launch of the Linguist Lounge. And I'm sorry if sometimes it was over the heads of the students, but hopefully you got something from it. And
No, no, I think they were, they seem to be, I mean, you can see it in their eyes when you're a teacher, of course, and you can see how interested they are. So thank you very much. And we hope to see you here in Egypt. If you can make it soon here, we'd like to have you in reality on campus here at MSA University. We'd like to welcome you again to MSA University virtually and to thank you very much. And we hope to see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
And bye-bye. Bye-bye. Have a nice day. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like also to thank Dr. Mon